Hey there, friends. My name is Jonathan Page. I'm the Director of Connectional Ministries for Innovation and Creativity, and I'm so grateful that you've joined us for another episode of Before Conference Conversations. These are a series of podcasts walking through all of the legislative committees that are going to be meeting as a part of the 2024 General Conference of the United Methodist Church that's meeting in Charlotte, North Carolina, April 23rd through May 3rd of 2024. And today, we are going to be talking about the conference's legislative committee. And so I am very excited to be joined by Alison Malloy and Kirk Nave, who are both from the Virginia Annual Conference and who are on the conference's legislative committee. So Alison, Kirk, good to see you.
Good to be with you.
Good to be with you, yeah.
So as we're getting started, for each of you, I'm curious, uh, what about General Conference has given you a calling towards this work? Being a delegate to General Conference is a fair amount of work, a fair amount of labor and time input. So, what about being a delegate has been something that you've found to be vocational or something that's worth your time to invest in?
I can start. I would say that I am an administrator at heart. It's how I'm sewn together, and fixing problems is kind of my jam. So, figuring these things out and finding a way forward is not something, and sitting in the meetings where it gets kind of intense, it's not something that sucks the life out of me. It kind of gives me energy. And so, that's the call I think that I feel to this work and to find a way forward.
I'm thinking of some words from a friend who encouraged me to start looking into becoming a General Conference delegate and said, Kirk, if not you, then who? And so it took some introspection. Do I have some gifts to offer to it? And I think I do, in a very humble manner. I come with ears, as I listen to people. But this is important work to be done. Very, very important work to be done. Yeah.
Well, keeping in mind all of that, as a part of your calling to the overall work of General Conference, I'm curious about this specific legislative committee. So, something that folks in the annual conference might or might not be aware of is that the conference's legislative committee may have the most number of pages of legislation of any of the legislative committees. So I think it takes a pretty special kind of call to this particular legislative committee. Kirk, maybe we'll start with you. What has you interested in conferences specifically? Why work on this legislative committee?
It's funny because when you look at it from a 50,000-foot view, it's like this is the committee that talks about committees, which sounds like watching paint dry. But I'm also a polity nerd. Like I read early American history and like read the biographies of John Adams, Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and others. Fascinating stuff that they could come up with a constitution. Organization matters. Polity matters. Process matters. Particularly when you're now talking about a global church. How do we come together where everybody gets a voice, everybody gets a vote, and we form things together? So that's kind of why I'm interested in this work.
I would echo much of what Kirk has said, and I would also note too, our delegation has quite a few new folks on it. And so the anticipated volume of this work and the anticipated intensity are two of the reasons where I thought, well, I could do this. And so for better or worse, here I am. But I do agree, this is a heavy lift, but it's a really important one. And so I'm grateful to serve alongside Kirk in this committee.
Great. Well,
to be clear, I'm the clergy person. Alison is the laity person. Our Virginia conference tries to have one of each on every legislative committee that we can do that.
That we can. That's right. There are a lot where we're fortunate because we have a total of 22 seats on the delegation, and there are only, I think it's 13 total legislative committees. We get to have multiples on a lot of those, but not every single, like mine. I'm the only person from Virginia. I'm not the only person, period. But yeah, that would not go well. But in any case, we're grateful to have both of you on the conference's legislative committee. So with that, it is time to jump into the work that you're into. So, as you think about just the general framework of all this legislation, does it kind of break down into pockets or areas of maybe broad themes that you might point to?
I think the big piece is regionalization. We are the room where it happens regarding regionalization because it requires a restructuring of our polity. And one of the things I want to get across to people that is that this is not a new idea for General Conference. I go back as far as the 2012 study on the worldwide nature of the church. In our previous video, I know with Grace Hahn, she kind of explained, we began as a U.S. church. We have been a U.S. dominated church until, as we have had mission work in other countries, they were formed as central conferences. Central conferences were allowed to adjust the Book of Discipline to their own cultural context. We have always been a regional church in that regard, but now it's about equity. We've been a U.S. dominated church throughout our entire history, and now nearly half of delegates to General Conference are going to be coming from places outside the United States, in those places that we call central conferences. So it's a matter of equity. The lack of equity has, historic roots in colonialization, where Western powers like the United States dominated the world. It's beyond time for us to get this done. The nice thing is it saves time at General Conference, and therefore it saves money. There are a number of issues that we deal with at General Conference that deal only with the United States. Think about our pension program, WestPath. Most other places in the Central Conferences don't even have a pension program. So it kind of gets under their skin, and they have to sit through General Conference dealing with our pension program, which has nothing to do with them. Other issues like how we handle real estate, things like our own trust clause, which has historic meaning in our United Methodist Church, does not apply in many other nations because their governments do not recognize, the way we have structured real estate. So we need an adaptable book of discipline for every section of the globe where the United Methodist Church exists. So,
Kirk, just a quick follow-up about the adaptability of the Book of Discipline, because this is a question I get sometimes. I'm sure you all have gotten too. When we're talking about regionalization and what parts of the Book of Discipline are adaptable, this does not include things like our doctrinal standards and theological tasks, correct?
That is very important to remember. The Constitution is a global subject. What we believe, our doctrine, our teachings, our theological task, all those things we share in common. It's those pieces where typically administration needs to be changed to a cultural context. Things like qualifications for ordination. We have colleges, bachelor's degrees readily available in the United States, not so much in many other countries. Seminaries are available here. I know it costs a pretty penny to get a seminary education, but it's readily available and expected of those to be ordained here, but not in other contexts. So you can see there are things that are different in different parts of the world that we need adaptability.
I want to follow up on one thing you said, Kirk. You said parts of our Constitution, the parts that require constitutional change, though, it's important for us to remember have a higher voting threshold, not just at the General Conference. It requires a 2/3 vote of the General Conference. And then following that, all of the annual conferences that meet in that coming year, really, will need to also do a vote, and 2/3 of the aggregate votes of folks across the globe who are voting on this in conferences across the globe. So not just in the US, not just in Virginia, 2/3 vote. We need 2/3 across the globe is what's required to pass the constitutional changes.
That's exactly right.
Yeah, thank you for that. And so just again, thinking we're going to have a moment to talk about some specific legislation, and we might dive back into regionalization a little bit then. Are there any other themes that are kind of emerging from the conference's legislative group?
I mean, I say we have a group of people that meet by Zoom who are on the Legislative Committee on Conferences already, and we've been digesting this. We started with the Slack group a couple of years ago. More recently, we've been meeting more frequently via Zoom. Unfortunately, we do not have a list of delegates from central conferences, even as of today, which, as we're recording, it's February the 28th. We're hoping to get that. We would love to have conversations with those. But there's a lot of things we need to deal with. And we're looking at the Jurisdictional Study Committee. We're looking at recommendations from the Council of Bishops regarding the number of bishops. Our team is like, we agree in principle, but some of the legislation may need some updating, some tweaking, some amending, and that kind of thing.
One other thing that I think you'll find in the conferences committee are a few petitions about continued opportunity for disaffiliation. And I will say that across our little team, I think we're of one accord that that moment has passed here in the United States. We've had plenty of time, but our siblings in central conferences have not been afforded that same opportunity. So certainly, while we would hate for disaffiliations to continue, if a central conference were to bring an opportunity like that, I think we would certainly consider, is this something that provides that opportunity to folks outside the U.S.?
Thank you for that. So let's talk in terms of particular petitions or anything like that. I know, we just talked about regionalization, for example. It's a big, broad topic where there are a number of different proposals that are at play. I wonder, are there any specific ones that kind of stand out to you as like, hey, this is really a direction that seems worth pursuing, or anything where you're like, hey, maybe not in that direction, or anything like that?
It looks like our Committee on Conferences is going to stay with, if you will, the main line. There is a consistent trail of evolution regarding regionalization, which started with the connectional table. In other words, the general church's council on ministries, we used to call it, the governing board from the general church. They had proposals regarding regionalization. And very quickly, if you don't know what that is, very simply, it takes all central conferences throughout the globe, changes their names to regions, and then also makes the United States a region and puts them all on square footing. That change was generally accepted by a group in the Philippines. They put forward what is called the Christmas Covenant. One of their annual conferences submitted legislation for the 2020 gathering of the General Conference, which we all know never happened. Christmas Covenant took the connectional tables idea, agreed with all of it, and added a few pieces. And then on top of that, most recently in the last 6 months or so, the Standing Committee on Central Conference Matters. These are folks who deal with central conferences throughout the globe. They took that work, tweaked it a little bit, but it's generally the same strain of legislation, and they all agree on the main things, if you will. So that's where our committee believes that we will probably begin our work to talk about regionalization.
Great. And a couple of other themes that, as we've had these legislative committee conversations, have kind of emerged as sort of priorities in the general conference season. One is the removal of harmful language. Is there anything coming up in conferences around that idea?
You want to answer that one, Alison?
You go for it, Kirk.
Okay. One thing to understand about regionalization is we have nothing to do with the harmful language. In other words, we deal with the Legislative Committee on Conferences in how the United Methodist Church is organized, if that makes sense. The harmful language, which is found, most of it in the social principles, it appears a couple other places, that will be dealt with the Committee on Board of Church and Society, the Committee on Church and Society. I believe they have 3 committees. I think it's number 2. Yeah, and we will not be dealing with that. However, if you're concerned about these things, regionalization, if the United States is a region, that would be some of the things that are adaptable within the United States. So in other words, our cultural context is how we would deal with these things rather than as a global perspective.
Sure.
One of the tools, though, that kind of would help us get there, Jonathan, as you kind of, I think, alluded to, are the global social principles. And so I think that that is something that folks across our committee understand as a necessary step also. And so, of course, as Kirk mentioned, that will tend to the harmful language largely.
Well, and that perfect segue, Allison. I was going to ask you about the revised social principles. If you haven't had a chance to view the thematic videos, we do our plug for all of our general conference resources at the end of the podcast. We will have a mid-pod plug for vaumc.org/GC 2024, where you can hear Allison talk about the revision to the social principles. And Kirk, you're right, that comes in the church and society legislation. That is one of the other priorities, but I think y'all have made clear that's really not something that you're finding in conferences. It's really focused just on regionalization and some of the other themes that we've discussed. So, Allison, I want to point to you because as you mentioned, you're a general conference vet. You kind of know this process. I'm curious, can you talk with folks about your preparation? Kind of what's it been like to be digesting legislation, and how you're doing that with others? Both of you have kind of alluded to to the group that's been meeting. Talk a little bit about the rhythm of that and just kind of what your preparation process has been like.
I don't know if I would consider myself a vet. I have been 1.5 times. I think 2019 counts as 0.5. So
That
I'll just,
that makes you a bet on our
okay,
in
okay.
our
1.5 times makes me a vet. So my preparations look like a lot of reading. And I am a read on hard copy kind of person. And so I know everybody does their preparation differently, but that's what works for me. And that sometimes makes things a little bit harder because I'm going back and forth and doing some research, because who is this person that keeps submitting all of these proposals that look almost identical to the social principles, or that look almost identical to some of these regionalization things? And it's important for me to do a little bit of research there to know, hey, well, they are now with another denomination, and maybe I need to look at it one more time and decide if it's still useful information for our consideration at this point. We may find that we have a good vet that's not. I'll say my preparation also involves folks from across our delegation and sharing notes. It's important that we specialize in our specific committee. But for instance, Jonathan, I should be looking to you for some of the parts that are in your committee, and same across the conference. But I will say too, Kirk and I are, I think, working hard to try to be good partners and saying, hey, did you catch this? Or maybe we missed this one here. I hope that we'll continue to partner like that and hold one another accountable and help one another when we miss things. It is quite a privilege that we can have two folks sitting with one another in many of our committees.
Yeah, Kirk, jump in here, and especially tell us a little bit about the group of folks that's convening to kind of lead this through.
Sure. These are folks put together by somebody from the list of delegates. Said, hey, anybody want to be a part of these discussions? And like I said, a couple years ago, we started with Slack, and now we're on Zoom, and we're just putting our heads together. As I said, no one from the central conferences as of this time. So it's been people from all around the United States with very different perspectives on all of this. I do want to reiterate for people what a weird general conference this is. I've been once before, so Allison's got a 0.5 up on me, but it was overwhelming enough to get a 3-ring binder, like this thick, with what we call the Advanced Daily Christian Advocate, all of the legislation that is brought. We received that, 1,200 pages, the original. And then we got, the volume 3, which is all the legislation that has been written since 2020. So all of that is before us. So there's been a lot to prepare for. I've been doing more, not hard copy, but PDF and highlighting things. For those of you that don't know, our Virginia Conference delegation meets regularly. I guess since December January, we're meeting every single month to, highlight legislation just like we're doing here in this video. We share all that information with the entire delegation, so we're always aware of the important things that are coming before us. So that's a bit of the preparation. I would also say beyond reading, there's a lot of prayer.
Yeah.
It's a lot of work, and we seek out other people. Say, hey, could you go ahead and read this legislation alongside of me? And what are the things that jump up to you that I may have missed, as Alison said?
Yeah. No, I think it's so wise, and I think y'all are both highlighting the importance of there's so much personal connection to the work, but there's also that social connection that says this isn't ours to do alone or on an island. It's a shared, it's connectionalism and in practice in a lot of ways.
It is connectionalism. I go back to, in preparation for 2019, I read the book, actually led my entire congregation in the book, Anatomy of Peace. The principle of that is if you've got difficult issues to deal with, you have to build relationships with people first so that you're looking at the whole person rather than just through the lens of this is where we agree or disagree. Because that's not all of who a person is. You build the trust relationships first, then you can have conversations that might be difficult.
Absolutely. Absolutely. That's a good book.
I do want to add one thing, Jonathan, if you don't mind, back to the committee that's been, or the group of us that have been gathering in preparation for the work of our committee. Our siblings across the globe in central conferences, many have not all received their invitation letters. And so, for instance, yesterday I met with a central conference member clergy person who has received their letter, but still, they don't know what committee they're on. And so I just want to highlight, it's not that this group is not hopeful about gathering with Central Conference delegates. In fact, I think we really are. And I think we're also kind of hanging on and waiting to learn who might join us and how we might support them and how we might, lock arms, work together and find our next best step in that way.
Yeah, and Kirk mentioned earlier, it's the end of February as we're recording this. We'll hope that by the time folks are listening, that this will be, resolved and all good. But it is important to realize there's a lot. Something that folks may or may not be aware of is there are just so many logistics when you're trying to get hundreds of people from all around the world to a central place. Things like, does everybody have a hotel room? Can everybody be fed? Right? Like those are all things. Then when you start bringing people in internationally, there's visa concerns, there's all sorts of travel documents that have to be prepared. So it's a really heavy lift, and it's been a heavier lift, I think, than maybe anybody anticipated this go around. And so we're continuing to be in prayer and hope that everybody's going to be able to gather that's duly supposed to be there, and that we'll make sure everybody's as informed as possible so that we can discern together the best for what God has intended for the United Methodist Church. Hey, so we're kind of getting near the end of our time here. Think about when we get to May 3rd or May 4th, when we're headed back home to Virginia. What is the story that you hope that we'll be telling in the wake of this general conference?
There's a phrase that someone shared with me. I don't remember where it came from, but I think it's really important. And that is, unity is not the same thing as conformity. We are a global church. I think regionalization is so important in that our nature, our unity is found in Jesus Christ. An analogy to that would be, what makes an American? My identity is all Americans need to be Republican or all Americans need to be Democrat. No, we're united in those things that we hold in common, that we love this country and so forth. Our unity as a church is found in Jesus Christ, that relationship. We're going to disagree about things. And that's why I say our cultural context, regionalization allows for those. It keeps us together, even in light of the things that we might disagree with. And I would argue that that's who United Methodists have been throughout our history. We understand Christian conferencing is a means of grace, that we grow the most when we surround ourselves with people who have different perspectives.
Thanks, Kirk.
I would just offer that I think one of the things that's most important to me is that we do this work in love. And so what we do is incredibly important. And I'm the broken record. What we do is incredibly important, but how we do it is more important than probably what we do. And so I just would say that one more time. And so my hope is that we do this in love and that the world sees that we are doing this work in love and we walk forward together in that way.
Amen. Amen. Any other closing thoughts, remarks, anything that we haven't unpacked that we should have in our time together?
Just be in prayer for us. We're now less than 2 months away, and there's much work still to be done. And we need to be grounded in prayer as we move into this.
I think that's right. I would say we know that this is an incredible privilege to serve as your General Conference delegate. And it's an incredible responsibility at the same time. And so holding us in prayer, cheering whomever it is in your community on that's a delegate, it would be appropriate, because some of these days are hard and some of them are really easy and some are great, but it would be very kind if you do that.
Amen. Well, hey, Alison, Kirk, this has been a blessing. Thank you so much for joining in today's conversation, and thank you to all of you who are tuning in, whether you're watching or listening, however you engaged in today's conversation. By the way, Kirk earlier did a thing where he was showing how big the legislation was. It was as big as his face. So just remember that in case you're only listening to this. But however you've chosen to tune in, know that we're really grateful for your continued attention to the work of General Conference and all that is going to take place. We mentioned this a few minutes ago, but just again to put a plug in, if you want more information about General Conference and about the Virginia Conference's involvement in General Conference, I encourage you to visit vaumc.org/GC2024. There you can find all of our thematic videos. You can find some neat infographics regarding General Conference, and you can also find all of our podcasts with each of our legislative committees and our representatives from the Virginia delegation to General Conference. So Alison, Kirk, thanks for being here. Thanks for tuning in, everybody. We'll see you again real soon.